Jihad, a war that will last until Judgment Day, is the way it's defined, interestingly enough. And as we're calling it on the media, America's new war. You know, it's really a shock to realize what a day brings. You know, we all live with linear assumptions. We all assume that tomorrow will be like yesterday, next week like last week, next month like last month, next year like last year. And then in our lives, events occur. Mathematicians would call them nonlinearities. They can be at the international level. The Berlin Wall can come down. It can be in the physical world with hurricanes or tornadoes. It can be in the medical world with a heart attack or whatever. It can be in the financial world where there's some disruption. But of course, we have events that occurred on the 11th of September of this year. Some major monuments in this country that are now just a memory. And these images that we've been seeing on the television, I hope will never grow old. I hope that they will maintain their impact on us personally. Not just for the sake of the 6,000, 7,000, whatever the number turns out to be, that didn't survive, or the families that still have their lives changed forever, and not just for New York or for the nation, but for every one of us in this country, because it'll never be the same. Hopefully, that this will be a wake-up call for America. And what strikes me so appropriate is the words of Admiral Yamamoto. He happened to say these things when he was the commander of the Japanese forces that attacked Pearl Harbor. He says, "I fear that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," and filled him with a terrible resolve. And the parallel between that aspect, at least, in Pearl Harbor and what we think is happening now is very appropriate. Now, so we've had a wake-up call. But the questions that we're getting barraged with here at the ministry, and appropriately so, is what are we up against? What is the real issue? And going further from that, what else can we expect and what should we be doing? So this, in a sense, is part two, trying to deal with the last two parts of those four questions. And what are we up against? Well, right now, the biggest manhunt that the world has ever seen is underway for a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. And one of the things that I think we all need to do is set aside our stereotypes. When we think of a Middle Eastern terrorist, we have certain images in our mind. I'm going to suggest that we do our best to set those aside, and let's try to understand what's really going on. He was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1957. So here's a man about 44 years old. He has 4 wives and 15 children, which is very typical in the culture he comes from. The Quran allows a Muslim 4 wives. Muhammad had 16, but that's neither here nor there. This is a guy that's very well educated. He comes from an extremely wealthy family, billionaire family. He's gone to the best schools. He has a whole background of wealth and all that brings. He had a destiny of billions of dollars that he voluntarily has abandoned to the chagrin of his family and even his country. He chooses to live in a small cave with no running water, rudimentary heating, and in a moment-by-moment, hour-by-hour fear for his life. That's his choice. That's the career that he has deliberately chosen. There's a $30 million reward on his head. Can you imagine that? That's like something out of a James Bond novel, not out of the daily newspaper. Why? Why did this guy, who's educated, he's not some deranged lunatic. That's so easy to dismiss if we don't happen to see the world the way he does. How does he see the world? What brought him to this? He was a carousing engineer in college. With his buddies, he would go to a big city, they'd have some drinks and do all the things that most college guys did. How did he get from that to this dedicated, committed professional? What turned him? A lot of background factors here. We need to stand back a little bit and try to put in perspective the Arab prosperity and also the identity crisis that came with the oil boom of the 1970s, when these desert tribes were suddenly all billionaires. We also need to understand how they felt about the triumph of revolutionary Islam in Iran when the Shah fell. And I tell you, Khomeini took over. We really need to understand the turning point in Osama bin Laden's life when there was the rallying cry of jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We are seeing, of course, the inevitable clash of cultures, Islam versus the West. Now, you need to understand, too, how these young college guys raised up from in an Islamic environment, even though they probably didn't take it that seriously, just like so many kids are in their teens. They're out finding their own way, but they came from that conservative background. Most visitors from Islam, when they hit a major Western city for whatever reason, they're shocked, not just by the affluence, but by the promiscuity of the West, the sin. You and I since we have so many different views than Islam, may not appreciate the degree to which they hate sin. They approach that by the rigors of the law. They don't understand grace. There's a whole bunch of things that we differ, but let's recognize that part of what drives them is their approach against sin. And that shocked some of these young men. In some of these cities, particularly Jeddah, where he was from, is a seedbed of intellectuals in Islam. The combination of the doubts of the intellectuals and the impressionable youth caused many of them to conclude that the only absolute and unconditional answer for them was to return to the fold of Islam in order to protect the Muslim world from the inherent dangers and sins of the West. They saw the West, and they didn't like what they saw that the affluence and freedom brought there with it. The sin, the liquor, the drugs, the rest of it. That may sound strange to us, but that was enough to get them to start looking more seriously at their background from Islam. Well, let's shift a little bit and take a look at Afghanistan, where all the world is watching right now. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. Pakistan carries the south and eastern border of it primarily, wedged between Afghanistan and India. China, of course, being to the east. Along the northern border, we have some of the former Russian, or I should say Soviet republics of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And then, of course, to the west we have Iran. So that's this interesting place called Afghanistan, and we're going to be talking a lot about Pakistan's involvement with Afghanistan as we go here. The big event we'll start at April 1978, when a group of Afghans seized power from the leftist regime of Mohammad Najibullah. He had a leftist regime. He was in many respects a puppet of the Soviet Union. But the secular and nationalistic but anti-communist Afghans successfully had a coup where they unseated him and took over. April 1978. Okay, that's an uprising that you and I would read in the paper and hardly take notice. But in December of 1979, Moscow intervened. They sent in troops. And again, you say, well, gee, that's no surprise. They're protecting what they regarded as a province. But we don't realize how that shocked the Islamic world. And this is pointed to as the turning point in Osama bin Laden's life. And the point I'm really going to make is many others like him. They were so shocked by that, they got involved. What the United States decided to do, because we were anti-Soviet, we saw this as an opportunity also. So we funneled major assistance to 3 Islamic fundamentalist organizations in the hopes of defeating Moscow's intervention. But also in Pakistan, General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, he was the military dictator of Pakistan. He just previously overthrown the prime minister back a couple of years earlier. He exploited the popularity of this appeal to help the Afghan rebels Here's the big evil Soviets coming down. We're going to get behind these Afghans, and he took advantage of that to help. In Pakistan, there are lots of the exiled Afghan leaders that were involved in this conflict. Saudi Arabia, which was also anti-communist. It's Islamic. Don't confuse me. The polarization was communist versus anti-communist. And so Saudi Arabia also provided substantial report. So we have, in effect, a three-nation support of the Afghan Muslims fighting the Russian troops coming in. The Mujahideen, as they're called, the warriors here, were financed, trained, and armed. And they were recruited from the 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan. In Pakistan, they had the Afghan refugees. They recruited some of these guys, financed them, set up training camps. They also recruited about 20,000 Islamic militants from all over the world. There were other Muslims that wanted to get in the action. The Afghan issue became a popular cause. We have Islamic militants from China, Southeast Asia, and so forth that are all getting mixed into the Mujahideen. All of this was largely coordinated and supervised by the CIA and also the ISI, which is the Pakistan equivalent of the CIA. The support that was thrown at this issue has been estimated by experts to approximate $40 billion. Over half of that was split between Saudi Arabia and the United States. A lot of the others came from donations from all over the world. So in approximate terms, there's probably about 10 billion from the U.S., about 10 billion from Saudi, 8 or 10 billion from each of Saudi Arabia and the U.S., and a lot of other support that came in. Now, in this morass of training and causes and let's help these Afghan rebels fight the evil Soviet Union, there was a leader, a promising young engineering graduate from an affluent family of construction contractors in Jeddah by the name of Osama bin Laden. This is where he's cutting his teeth, and he's building his relationships with all these people. What we didn't realize at the time, it's easy to look back and see these things now, is a greater storm was being seeded by all this. Anyway, by February 15th of 1989, over 100,000, about 115,000 Soviet soldiers finally gave up. They finally retreated from Afghanistan. We'd been supplying them with all kinds of weapons, including Stinger missiles. Those Stinger missiles brought down the Soviet choppers. They finally scratched. It was also about the time the Soviet Union had its own problems starting to come unravel too, by the way. But in any case, the fact that the Soviets retreated was a win, a profound win for the Islamic rebels. Washington celebrated, of course. Boy, look what we did. Brzezinski, who is really the architect of all this under Carter, he saw the helping of the Afghan rebels as a way to try to unwind the Soviet Union. That was his mentality. He had no grasp that he would be starting something far more serious even than the communist threat from Russia. One of the questions that has to be asked is, did the founders of the U.S. policy in Afghanistan during the Carter administration, that was from 77 to 81, realize that their zeal in defeating the USSR laid the foundation for a phenomenon that would spread through the entire Islamic world and endanger the U.S. homeland? That's really what we'll discover happened here. Did anyone ever notice the glaring contradiction in the U.S. policy? We're bolstering the Islamic zealots in Afghanistan and opposing the Islamic zealots in neighboring Iran. Can you try to picture them trying to figure out what's our agenda? There's no consistency. There's no way to rationalize that. Well, that leads into what I call an incubation period. Because following the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, the Afghan Arabs, as they're called, but that's a term of the press. Most of these were no longer Afghans. They were from China, from all kinds of countries. They happened to have, what was in common was the Islamic teaching. But anyway, they called them Afghan Arabs. And that, of course, included bin Laden, who was not Afghan either. He's from Saudi Arabia. They went home. They drifted homeward because the big fight was over. But they all went home with a heightened perspective, not just of Afghan and the Soviet Union, but of Islam. And they also viewed countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt that they saw them as client regimes just like Afghanistan was. See, the war was all about Afghanistan being a client or a puppet of the Soviet Union. Boy, did we free them of their puppet master. But they turn around and look at Saudi Arabia and Egypt as clients of the U.S. from their point of view. They regarded that as, inappropriate, and they because these are young, trained, guerrilla-trained, indoctrinated young men, are increasingly vocal. But now they'd been bonded together because they'd all shared in these camps together, and the camps are called madrasas, by the way, and training camps, where their camaraderie was welded not just for guerrilla tactics, but for Islamic indoctrination. And so they're all going home, and they're all increasingly vocal. Now, in 1990, we, of course, had the Kuwait crisis, and we're all familiar with it from our point of view. 540,000 non-Muslims, American troops, non-Muslim troops, were on Saudi Arabian soil. That is a violation, in their view, of Sharia law. That is, to have non-Muslims on Muslim soil under their own flag is considered a breach, especially to the pious ulemas, the religious scholars, and this is all a violation. So, in March of 1991, this growing discontent is intensified when the Pentagon failed to carry out the full withdrawal from the kingdom. The war was over. The U.S. indicated they're going to withdraw the troops, and they don't. There's a lot of them left. So this is like a thorn in the side of the Muslims. Why don't they get out of there? Now, bin Laden is among these that is very, very outspoken on this, because he thinks it's the duty of Saudi Arabia, especially because they are the custodians for the most revered sites, Medina and Mecca, to be pure and not be compromised by these foreign, okay, maybe there's a need for now, but that need is over. Why aren't they going home? And he ended up being so outspoken on this, I won't go through all the details, is that he ends up getting stripped of his citizenship of Saudi Arabia and expelled from the country. Now, he is in one of the most powerful, influential families. Mohammed bin Laden, his father, owns one of the largest construction companies that was selected to do the additions to the mosque in Medina and the mosque in Mecca. The profit on that project, not the project, the profit on the project was $90 million. And it would have been Osama bin Laden's deal if he'd stayed. But he clung to his political convictions, the purity of his position, and was stripped of his citizenship and expelled from the country. You may not agree with his views, but you got to respect the strength of his character. He was doing what he stuck to his gun. Now the storm clouds gather worse. By about December of 1991, of course, the Soviet Union is coming unwound, but this is a second wind to these radical mujahideens that are scattered around the Islamic community. Because now not only have they beat Afghanistan, but even the Soviet Union's come crashing down. Their mind is they can do the same thing with the West. Because they're against the whole Western way of life. Now, in April of 1992, Mujahideen had seized power in Kabul. By 1994, the rise of a group of these, calling themselves the Taliban. Taliban just means the students. The rise of the Taliban movement. And by September of 1996, the Taliban had captured Kabul. And so that's the ruling group today. The Taliban, it stands for Students of Islam. It's an interesting name because most of these guys are alumni, if you will, of these training camps. So they learned all their skills and all their fundamentalism from the madrasas that were there along the Pakistan border. Now, what they were trying to do, have been trying to do, is try to create what is for them the ideal Islamic community. So they're enforcing Sharia law, but they're doing it to an extreme that even shocks many of the Muslims. Punishments under Sharia law for infractions include imprisonment, beatings, amputations, or executions. As you may know, there are some Muslim countries where if you're caught stealing, they cut your hand off. First time I was in Algeria, many years ago, I was a consultant to the government for some things. The week I arrived there, a purse snatcher was executed because he was declared by the court as socially unredeemable. It happened to be his third offense, minor thing, but it was his third offense, and the court decided he was socially unredeemable, so I think they beheaded him, as I recall. Under Sharia law, in the Taliban, for them, music, television, smoking, even Western hairstyles are all illegal. Now, some of you probably have seen some. You say they probably should be. No, I'm kidding. Women have been barred from education and jobs. They're barred from school and work. And they are supposed to be accompanied by a man when they go out. They're not supposed to be out of the house without a man present. There's a long list. I've just selected a few of the other. Teaching religions other than Islam is not only punishable, it's punishable by death. Now, what the Taliban's also done, they've reopened all these training camps that are near the Pakistan border. These are the ones that were originally established by the CIA and the ISI. They opened them for guerrilla training, for fundamentalist indoctrination. And these camps are populated with volunteers from all over the world, places like China, Southeast Asia. Muslims there getting trained in all these political views, as well as the guerrilla skills, how to make bombs and all that stuff. Give you another example of some what's going on right now. You may have read about these 8 aid workers. Currently, there's 2 American women, 4 Germans, and 2 Australians that are being held on trial for spreading Christianity. These 8 were in the country as aid workers, helping to feed the Afghanis, who are starving, by the way. About 3 million of whom are dependent upon relief food after the 22 years that they've experienced war. The foreign aid workers were allegedly caught showing videos about Jesus to Muslim families, of course, and are accused of possessing Bibles in Afghan languages, which is a capital crime in that community. We take our Bibles so for granted. It's hard for us to imagine a place where if you're caught with one, it's death. Anyway, the tensions continue to increase. By the time you get to November 1995, we have a number of incidents. The bombing at the Saudi National Guard base at Riyadh killed 5 U.S. soldiers who happened to be stationed there. 3 out of the 4 guys that were arrested and subsequently executed were Afghanis. What they mean by that, they're not from Afghanistan. That's what the press calls it. No, 3 out of 4 were part of this Mujahideen clique. We don't know what their nationalities really were. They're part of the freedom fighters that some people might call them, from that were fighting the Soviet Union earlier. Some months later, June 25th of 1996, there was a truck bombing outside the Al-Khobar complex near the Tehran air base. 19 Americans killed, 400 injured. This is the tension is starting to build. Why are they doing this? Because it's an expression of Islam that the Americans don't belong there. It's a Muslim country. That's the root issue here. So bin Laden, from all this, calls for a jihad against the Americans in Saudi Arabia. One of the quotes from pushing out this American occupying enemy is the most important duty after the duty of belief in God. I want you to notice the tone. This isn't just propaganda. They really see this as a theological issue. It's easy for us to dismiss that. Well, that's just, script writing. That's propaganda. I think it's a mistake for us to underestimate the depth of their commitment. Saudi Arabia as a U.S. client is the issue. The Saudi authorities admitted, finally, that there's about 5,000 Americans on Saudi soil. Frankly, informed estimates actually from our side put this figure closer to 20,000, in part in support of the sophisticated weapons that were installed still on some of the bases. And now the official explanation for all this that's published is that it is to enforce the no-fly zone in southern Iraq. You may recall the tensions after the war with Iraq, where they were, gassing and using chemical weapons against the Kurds and all that. We instituted this no-fly zone. That's the cover story. But now look at this cover story from the point of view of Osama bin Laden and his gang. This seemed contrived for at least 3 reasons. Why not limit the stationing of warplanes and the support for them in Kuwait and Bahrain, which were the 2 places that were beneficiaries of the whole operation in the first place? Why Saudi Arabia? And they're sensitive about Saudi Arabia, particularly because of its custodianship of the holy sites. You see, it's a theological issue to them. Second reason, the no-fly zone wasn't imposed until August of 1992, 17 months after the Gulf War. See, from these guys, that's one of these flaky cover stories. And there also the point out is, why couldn't the carriers of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain and permanently in the Persian Gulf, assume the duties? What do you have to have people installed on Saudi. So from their point of view, this is all contrived. Now, what they don't deal with, what was the real reason we're there? I don't want to get into it here, but there was part of the reason we're there is to protect the House of Saud, which is under attack by other groups, and there's a whole another scenario dealing with that. And our presence there, in part, was to be able to respond, because the same insecurities we have right now in the U.S. in certain areas, the House of Saud was having at Mecca, because there was a coup that took it over for a while. There was a whole incident there that is another issue. But anyway, the continuing presence of American forces provided the fuel for these guys Osama bin Laden and his regulars to view Saudi Arabia as a client of the USSR, just like a client of the U.S., just as Afghanistan was of the USSR. Now, the tensions continue to increase over all this, and meanwhile, as the tensions increased with Washington and Baghdad, the buildup of the U.S. Armada resulted in the fatwa. A fatwa is a religious decree. And of course, in Islam, religion and legal is together, so it's a formal decree of the one of February 23rd of 1998. And this language here is very similar to the one they used against the USSR in Afghanistan. The fatwa of February 23rd, 1998, the ruling to kill Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it, in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's the main mosque in Jerusalem, and the Holy Mosque, that's the one in Mecca, from their grip, in order for their armies to move out of all lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim. This is the instruction, the formal instruction that goes out to Muslims. We're going to kill Americans and their allies, wherever you find them. Now, obviously, most of us, when they said back in 98, well, gee, you made an American kind of nervous if he's in an Islamic country. But it doesn't limit it to Islamic countries. It's obviously being interpreted quite broadly. Now, he continues to build his theological foundations for escalating the jihad. His vision for the future is presently being circulated in a manuscript calling for global jihad against the U.S. This manuscript is in Arabic and certain South Asian languages being circulated among the leadership for their reactions. The title of it's called America in the Third World War, and of course calls for a jihad against America. He calls on the entire Muslim world to rise up against the existing world order, to fight for the right to live as Muslims. For Islamists, there can be no compromise, coexistence, and so forth. Very extreme language. So we're dealing with a theological conflict, not traditional geopolitical or economic issues here. Jihad will never end. It will last to the day of judgment, is the declaration from their clerics. Let's talk a little bit about, we all have this mentality that, gee, if they just get Osama bin Laden, that'll take care of it all. That's very naive. He does not have an organization as we think of organizations, hierarchies and departments and stuff. He has his core group go out to the madrasas. These are the training academies. In Afghanistan, initially there were 40,000 jihad devotees. In Pakistan, about 70,000, supplemented by 100,000 elsewhere. So you're talking probably in the neighborhood of 210,000 here. Senior officers are about 3,500. And there are hundreds of those that are equipped intellectually and training-wise to step in his shoes. So you get bin Laden, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but don't think it's going to solve any problems. They've got strength and depth, apparently. We have 6,400 other commanders in 12 centers. Centers in North America, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Albania, Kosovo, Algeria, Chechnya, Tajikistan, and the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. The Philippines, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Somalia, just for starters. They have recruitment centers in over 50 countries. And there's a guy by the name of Yosef Bodansky who's written a book, Bin Laden, the man who declared war on America, published in 1999. He's the director of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. He's also the director of the research group at ISSI, one of the major think tanks that deal with these kinds of issues. So this is not some kind of flagrant thing. This is competent. It's a competent book and gripping reading. It's the whole life of bin Laden and all the background. Let's talk a little bit about we have no idea what the resources are. We know that the Taliban income alone from the drug trade exceeds $8 billion a year. They launder that money through the Russian mafia, giving them a 10 to 15% commission. That gives them an income of over $1 billion per year. And we have no idea how much is involved. We do know it involves dozens of countries throughout the entire world. Well, let's see. Let's keep going here. Where are we heading, and what can we expect? Well, first of all, obviously, we are plunged in global terrorism, and this isn't a kind of thing that we're going to solve by getting eventually, and I'm sure eventually we will, is to get bin Laden. Many experts think we'll never get him, but I suspect we will. But the real point of all this is even if you do it, it won't solve anything. There's global terrorism. I'll tell you the good news. It explodes the conspiracy myth. You know, it's fascinating as just a student of American culture to realize how we always attribute whatever catastrophe there is to one lone deranged guy. John Wilkes Booth killed Abraham Lincoln. Except experts today understand that it wasn't John Wilkes Booth that was killed. He got away because he was part of a plot with Seward, the Secretary of War. The historians are having a field day with that because it was a conspiracy too. But nevertheless, as you go right through American history, whether it's John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, whatever, it's always one lone guy that's somehow deranged because that hopefully ends it, right? I was watching the History Channel, and I frankly was, like I often do when I'm in a hotel room or something, I'll just channel switch for 15 minutes over before going to bed, just to see what's going on, get some news and just see what's going on. And I couldn't turn it off. Because they have apparently, I didn't get a chance to see they apparently have a 5 one-hour series on just the men who killed John F. Kennedy. And they have, I have quite a library on that, because I was interested in that way back at one time. I'm astonished with the evidence that has come up. They actually have a picture of the gunman on the grassy knoll. And the point, and without getting into all that here, the point is, there's another case where all the evidence makes it clear it wasn't a lone guy. It may not have been even Lee Harvey Oswald, except as a patsy. Anyway, the point is that we have this affinity for the conspiracy myth. And whenever we have a hijacking or an act of terrorism, we always somehow are given this impression that, well, that's some kooks that are just extremists and doing this because they're off the rocker or something. And what we, I think, have to face the reality, there's no way they can ever convince us that the events of September 11th were not a well-planned, complicated program of professionals that had several years in the training of it and the planning of it and the coordination of it. In fact, there's parts of it that we're still discovering, and there's more to come. So it's not like we need to understand that this is not this is a highly unified, knowledgeable, committed group that are implementing these programs. And I think we know enough about it today to realize, from our point of view, that it's driven by a satanic agenda. You always know the source of it by the fruits. And when you see the subjugation of those countries, when you see the way they treat their own people, when you see the values that they really embrace, you begin to realize that this is from the Prince of Darkness. But don't be confused that these are people that are going to be easily turned around. They are committed to what they're doing. Let's talk a little bit more about the technologies available. Obviously, conventional assaults is what we experience, whether they're hijacking or assassinations or the dismal events of September 11th of this year. But let's realize that there's other technologies available to them that are accessible to terrorists. Biochemical weapons, electromagnetic weapons, and I'll come back to that. That may be a new one for you. And believe it or not, nuclear weapons. Well, let's talk about each one of these possibilities, because you're asking what's it going to be like. We're not here to pull our punches. We're not here to alarm. We're here just to try to get a perspective. But let's recognize that the advent of all of these things are also going to impose security issues. And security is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's naive to presume that we're going to ever have society in this country like we've had in the past. We have very open, free society, and it's clear that these adversaries are not going to go away. We're not going to get them all. There's going to be imposed for our own security all kinds of constraints. Yes, there will be infringements on our freedoms. Where will that balance be found? No one knows. Some will try to go too far. Some will try to fight it. We know long run, those freedoms come at a very, very high price. And that's the heritage that we should hold dear. But that's a whole other issue. Let's just recognize that that is coming. Now, we've talked about conventional assaults. We sort of take that for granted. Guns, knives, whatever. Let's talk about biochemical a little bit. Biochemical terrorism is very available. Sarin, taboon, anthrax, plague, botulin, they're all readily available agents. They're terrible agents for military use because they're hard to control and you can't focus them. There's all kinds of problems with them as a classical military weapon, but they're a dream weapon for a terrorist. You may recall on March 20th of 1995, sarin, which is a nerve gas type of thing, was unleashed in a Tokyo subway. Only 12 were injured, over 5,500 were, only 12 were killed, 5,500 were injured because they used an impure mixture. If they'd done it right, it could have been far, far worse. They didn't do it properly, it turned out. But this sarin can kill within minutes. It's one of the rare agents that actually can work through your skin, not just obviously inhaled. So contact or inhalation is a typical form. Now, these kinds of techniques, chemical or even biochemical, are far more available and they're less costly than nuclear or some of these more exotic weapons. In fact, if you have a room, a basement, in some basement, 20 feet on a side, and you can stock it with equipment that's not any more complicated than the fermentation equipment you'd have if you're going to make beer, and you have a protein-based culture, a gas mask, and a plastic overgarment, you're in business. Your investment to put this together is probably going to be less than $20,000. And you can start producing agents that can be maliciously used. The reason it's so advantageous for a terrorist is the symptoms from injecting this into a community of some kind can be delayed for many days. Sometimes the symptoms take 2 or 3 days to show up, sometimes a week or two, depending on what agent you're talking about. Which means the perpetrators can get out of there. They can introduce this, say, into a city water supply, and they've got 2 or 3 days to make an exit, slip away. If it's a biological rather than a chemical one, it's contagious, which means it can spread through the culture. You infect 5 or 10 people, but they catch planes, and there's 40, 60 people on the plane, and on. You get the picture. Treatments for these are often elusive and uncertain. They work, but not always, kind of thing. Inoculation. Even if you have inoculation, do you have enough supply to take care of a city or a community? They're expensive. How do you administer them? Gee, there's not enough to go around. Got a city of 10,000, we only got 1,000 shots here. What are you going to do? Who's going to make those decisions? I mean, it goes on and on. See, the logistics of limited supplies, the issues of triage, the issue of quarantines, assuming they're even possible in a complex culture. These are tough things that there are meetings going on day and night among people who are responsible for metropolitan security, trying to wrestle with these things. The Internet's full of discussions of these things. Where do these things come from? They're being manufactured all over the world. According to the Office of Technology Assessment, the United States Senate hearings, here are over a dozen countries that are presently developing biological weapons. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, Taiwan, even Israel, Egypt, India, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, Bulgaria, South Korea, South Africa, China, and of course Russia. You notice the first 5, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and North Korea. These are regarded by most of us as rogue states. And indeed they are. Russia has the largest and most aggressive biological warfare program. Iraq is developing over a dozen different types of pathogens, including genetically altered microorganisms, which means unless we know how as they mutate or as they're changed, that may change the remedies. Even if we knew what they have, it's changing. I mean, it's a race. Also, anthrax and others are in production. The estimates are that they're making enough anthrax to fill 2 warheads every week in Iraq. North Korea presently offers 13 kinds of bacteria, which are being produced by 9 different plants, all for export. There is a world market for this stuff. There are people who traffic in this stuff. And North Korea has 9 plants supporting 13 product lines for that source of revenue. And I say biological symptoms typically delayed for 2 or 3 days. The other thing about these things, facilities are virtually impossible to yield to traditional surveillance. From a satellite or something else, how can you tell what's being made in someone's basement? Now Now, we talk a lot about this in more detail in our briefing pack called Behold a Pale Horse, about the whole biotechnology issue. But it's interesting that just the last couple of days, we discover that crop dusters were grounded. You know what crop dusters are? Planes that dust crops. And employees of a Florida fertilizer company said that a group of Middle Eastern men repeatedly asked about crop duster planes in the months leading up to the terrorist attacks. An employee identified one of the men as Mohammed Atta, believed to be one of the suicide hijackers of the terrorist attacks. They also found manuals in the effects of the terrorists that about biologicals and crop dusting and all this, so they suspect there was an agenda. And there are others that may be programmed to do whatever. So that's biochemical. Let me mention something else just to broaden your horizon here. It frankly startled me. I thought I knew a little bit about this, but I was quite surprised to see how homespun it has become. And that's the area of electromagnetic weapons. What do we mean by an electromagnetic attack? How do you know if you've been attacked electromagnetically? Well, you hear a distant crack of lightning. I didn't time this right. A few minutes ago, we had a great lightning strike outside, and it would have been great if I could have adjusted the slides and get into it. I could have. What happens afterwards, you discover that TVs and fluorescent lights are glowing even though they're turned off. That gives you a little eerie feeling. Your cellular phone, your Palm Pilot, or your MP3 player are warm to the touch even though they're turned off and inoperative. Your computer and everything in it is toast. All your data, magnetic data, toast. The computer itself, toast. Microcircuits, wherever they might be in the region, are not disabled for a while. They're toast. They're over. And by the way, it's going to be, you notice it's also very quiet. Because you suddenly realize there are no cars that are running either, unless they happen to be diesel, maybe. EMP, electromagnetic pulse technology. It's a category of weapons that some of you guys may have been reading about. It's all derived from what's called the Compton effect. A guy by the name of Arthur Compton, back in 1925, discovered an effect that if you fire a stream of high-energy photons into atoms with low atomic numbers, what results is an ejection of a lot of electrons. And that's a physics effect that turned out to be very important in the development of nuclear weapons. Way back. His Compton effect in 1925 became very, very important in the 40s when we were, Manhattan Project and the rest. In 1958, we launched in the Pacific these thermonuclear bombs, the hydrogen bomb tests in 1958. And one of these that launched at a very high altitude. Among other things, there were bursts of gamma rays that were striking oxygen and nitrogen in the atmosphere that released a hurricane of electrons for hundreds of miles from the so-called Compton effect. Street lights were blown out in Hawaii. In Australia, they couldn't navigate. Navigation was disrupted for 18 hours from the magnetic effects of that nuclear weapon. Now, the whole idea of creating electromagnetic bombs, say, what would you want to do that for? Well, the Army would like to have it because they could explode, artillery shells being fired at you could explode them in flight. Because most of them have some kind of electronic fuse, and if you could have them prematurely fire, go off, that's an advantage. Navy is anxious for this technology because it could neutralize anti-ship missiles at sea. Air Force, of course, is interested for bombers, fighters, cruise missiles, and even unmanned drones to be equipped with what they call E-bombs or EMP bombs. These would be among the most sophisticated weapons ever built. The first major tests are scheduled for next year. And I have always regarded this as a highly classified area for people with big budgets and very exotic technologies. So it's there in the deep, deep, dark areas of classification. Well, EMP technology can render a very large area totally void of electronics and communication. But again, it's typically a highly classified environment. It's usually associated with nuclear developments and so forth, or high temperature superconductors. There are a lot of studies going for defensive hardening of these things. We always used to smile at the Soviet MiGs when we captured one because the radios were all vacuum tubes. We had transistors, ha ha ha. Well, they're hardened, we're not. Now they may have had that because they were backward electronically. But then again, a byproduct is that they're not as susceptible to EMP effects that way. So there was a lot of debate among some of our strategists. Are they just really behind, or are they ahead in a sense? But there's something else that I want to just include here to confuse you all, and that's what they call flux compression generators. The thing that makes this interesting is these can be homemade. You can make one in your basement. Now, what is it? The idea is to have a propagating short circuit which will compress a magnetic field, and you're doing this while you're reducing the inductance of an inductor, and that will produce a gigantic ramping current pulse. The ramp time will be measured in millionths of a second, and the peak current could be in the tens of millions of amps. This could make a lightning bolt look like a weak flashbulb. How would you go about doing this? And by the way, you can do this probably for less than $1,000. Popular Mechanics estimates maybe $400. Here's a sketch. You have the basic elements in this diagram here, is that you have a coil of wire that goes the length pretty much of as much as you can, a long length here. And then you have just inside that coil of wire an expandable soft copper tube, and that's spaced from the wire. And inside the copper tube you have some explosive. Okay? And what you're going to do here, you have a battery and some capacitors to store up a lot of energy, and use those capacitors to charge the coil and create the magnetic field around the coil, and then you fire the explosion. Let's see what would happen here. If this is the plot of the electromotive force, magnetic force, and you explode, as the explosion proceeds down this tube, it expands the tube, shorting out the coil, making the remaining part of the coil that's still electrically effective shorter and shorter. And as shorter it gets, the more that is compressing the magnetic field, until finally you get to the end, you have a pulse that would be measured in the tens of millions of amps in current terms. You have a magnetic wave that will, in a matter of minutes, fry all microcircuits within its range. But then you also have some other effects we'll come to. What are the countermeasures? The typical countermeasure for something like this is what's called a Faraday shield. You probably saw one in the movie Enemy of State, if you remember that cage that Gene Hackman retreated to solve problems and things. That's a Faraday shield. The idea is that the shield will, any impinging magnetism will be grounded, right, directly to ground. Foreign military experts suspect that these are not going to be effective enough because very high frequency pulses can penetrate vents and get around some of the ins and outs of that. But there's another issue. The delay time electromagnetic pulse effects, localized surges will create derivative surges, and it's almost like a string of firecrackers. And these localized surges will disable power lines and communication lines. And so they suspect that the electromagnetic bombs, if they can be made as easily as it looks like they can be made, they could be a third world equalizer. This is the kind of thing that terrorists could fabricate, test, improve, whatever, and use quite easily. What could happen to a city is it returns that city to a century ago. No electricity. Electricity becomes something you see when lightning strikes, because you have no power, you have no communications, but you have no microcircuits. And it's interesting that the Indian Institute of Defense specifically fears that Pakistan might have such weapons. As I was reading on this, I was intrigued. Of all the people that are concerned about it, it's India, who's a traditional enemy of Pakistan, which of course is our partner at the moment going into Afghanistan. So it's interesting to watch the things going on. Well, let's take the really scary one that most of us are aware of but probably don't take seriously, and that's nuclear. There are over a dozen countries that are nuclear capable today. U.S., Russia, France, Germany, Great Britain, but also Israel, China, India, Pakistan. But surprising enough, South Africa, Iran, Argentina, Brazil, North Korea, Libya, Iraq, all have or shortly will have nuclear weapons. Now, there are 27 countries that are developing advanced ballistic missiles, over 66 countries that have the technology to field a surface skimming cruise missile. Any country that can build a jet aircraft can build a cruise missile. And of course, there's been substantial traffic in stolen nuclear warheads on the black market for over 10 years. That's no surprise. Ever since the Soviet Union started to fall apart, the security, that which they had was falling apart. There were all kinds of officers looking to make a buck. These things got on the black market. And I know from personal experience that several of these have been sold to Iran. I'm told by people who are watching this area that they believe that Osama bin Laden has some, more than one. We'll see, because I can't imagine him having one not using it. So I think most people feel it's not a question if, it's when there'll be some nuclear event. And boy, when that happens, the rule books go out of the window. General Alexander Lebed, when he was in the United States, indicated on camera, I think it was 60 Minutes, he said there were 132 suitcases, nukes made by Russia, and 84 of them are missing from inventory. And it's his suspicion that they've been somehow sold to terrorists. Was he making a political statement? Maybe. Is it credible? A lot of people take it very seriously. George Tenet, the director of CIA, says the possibility that a missile armed with a weapon of mass destruction would be used against the U.S. force or interest is higher today than during most of the Cold War, and it will continue to grow. The paradigm of the past was easy to grasp. Its dominant feature was that it had two superpowers locked in a confrontation with clear limits and well-understood rules. Today there are fewer rules and fewer people willing to play by them, as the constant march of technology threatens to break new paradigms, not today, even before they take shape. And that's from the Global Trends 2015 from the National Intelligence Council. Jesus told us about these things. He said in Matthew 24, verse 22, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. That's a technology statement. That statement made no sense during the Civil War. If you're reading that to Abe Lincoln, he'd probably have a tough time visualizing the world wiping itself out with muskets and bayonets. You follow me? Today, it's a very descriptive summary of technology that's available to people bent on mischief. But let's remember 2 Timothy 1:7. God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So I'd like to talk now about the most advanced technology in the universe. There's a technology available to you and I that vastly eclipses all the technologies we've talked about. And I'll call that the technology that explores hyperspaces. Paul tells us, he gives us an assessment of our predicament, our intelligence report, if you will. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul tells us, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And let me paraphrase a little bit. We wrestle not against nuclear weapons or biotech or electromagnetic or whatever. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And those last four terms in the Greek refer to ranks of angels. That's what we're up against. We're not up against Osama bin Laden or his gang, however sincerely committed they are to their viewpoints. We're against the guy that's behind, the guy that they inadvertently are worshiping. That's the guy that we're really up against. And you don't go after him with tanks and B-52s. Although there are a lot of them headed his way. We don't get many glimpses in the scripture of what I call the dark side, but there's an interesting passage in Daniel chapter 10 that I'll just summarize for you. In Daniel chapter 10, Daniel he fasts for 21 days. For 3 full weeks, he eats no pleasant bread. He just eats a bare diet because he's fasting and praying. And after 21 days, he gets greeted by a heavenly visitor. That heavenly visitor is there to give him 2 chapters of prophecy. Chapters 11 and 12 are in effect given by this visitor to Daniel. But he says something very strange when he arrives. He says when Daniel first started his fast, he was dispatched to go see Daniel. But he was withstood for 21 days, apparently in combat, by somebody that he calls the Prince of the Kingdom of Persia. Now that's not Darius or Cyrus or a human guy. It's the spirit being that's assigned behind the scenes, Satan's lieutenant or whatever. He was withstood 21 days by the Prince of Persia. And he explains to Daniel that it's taken him 21 days to get through. He said, I'm going to give you some prophecies in a bit. And then, when I'm all through with you, Daniel, I've got to go back and fight him again. And after him, there will be, and by the way, he said he couldn't get through the 21 days until Michael, the chief prince, came and helped him. Michael came and then he got through and he's now here, Daniel, here's the story. And after you get chapter 11 and 12, in effect, he's now going to have to go back and deal not only with the Prince of Kingdom of Persia, but the Prince of Power of Greece. And that's it. As you study Daniel 10, it's sort of a prelude to 11 and 12, the prophecies, the climactic prophecies of the book of Daniel. The book of 12 chapters, 11 and 12, the last two chapters. But as we glimpse this, you can't help when you read that passage, and I encourage you to do so at your leisure. There's a couple of questions you have to ask yourself. What would have happened if Daniel had stopped fasting and praying after, say, 19 days? It doesn't say that there's a linkage, but you can't help but infer that there's somehow some kind of link between his fasting for 21 days and the fact that it took this messenger 21 days to get through. We often say, gee, I don't hear God. Well, maybe it's because we don't fast and pray enough. And by the way, fasting and praying is not just an Old Testament thing. Jesus said that his would, and there's a whole New Testament study you can do on fasting and praying. We're going to move on. There's another case that I love to take. This is one of my favorites. In 2 Kings 6, we have an incident that I love in this area. Where we use the term spiritual warfare so glibly. Well, I had some spiritual warfare the other day, and I won't, well, yeah. But it's real. In 2 Kings 6, verse 8, the king of Syria, who was against Israel, the king of Syria warred against Israel. And he took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. Right? And the man of God, namely Elisha, sent unto the king of Israel, that's his boss, saying, beware that thou pass not in such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down. And the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told him and warned him of, and saved himself there, not once or twice. In other words, what they're saying is, the Syrians are trying to lay a trap for the king of Israel. But Elisha whispers in his ear and says, hey, don't go there because they're going to, set you up. And that doesn't happen once or twice. It happens a lot. In fact, that's the problem. It's happening so regularly. The king of Syria is smelling a rat. In verse 11, it says, therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled for this thing. He called his servants and said to them, will ye not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? In other words, he's assuming that one of you guys around my staff table here is a snitch. Which of you is it? How else can the king of Israel constantly second guess what I'm going to do? He's got a pipeline. One of his servants said, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet that is in Israel telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. 2 Kings 6:12. I believe it's the first recorded phone trap in the Bible. So one of his servants, they somehow figured out that the hidden weapon, the secret weapon of the king of Israel was his prophet. He's got his prophet who's got a gift. So what does the king of Israel do? He said, go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told him, saying, behold, he's in Dothan. Therefore sent he, that is the king of Assyria, he sent thither horses and chariots and a great host. Sent out his rangers and his Spetsnaz and his KSKs and SAS team and all his commandos, whatever. And a great host. And they came by night and compassed the city round. Okay? Now I love this. This is such fun. When the servant of the man of God, Elisha has his orderly, or whatever you call him. When the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. That must have rattled the guy. He got up early in the morning and he looked out and he realized they're surrounded by troops, hostile troops. The servant said unto unto Elisha, alas, my master, how shall we do? What are we going to do now? Elisha, and I always visualize him being very, almost impatient. Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. There's nothing like a good platitude to comfort the soul, right? That must have been that. Yeah. And I infer that the steward, the servant of Elisha, wasn't too satisfied with that rather platitudinal answer. So Elisha prays, and here I see him exasperated. He said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes so that he might see. Let him take a peek, Lord, The Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and guess what? The mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire around Elisha. Very thrilling little story. And yet we need to recognize that this is not just a little story, it really happened. Can you imagine that servant looking around? Lifted the veil, and he realized they were protected by chariots of fire. And that isn't some kind of colorful, comforting superstition. That's the real reality. That's one reason I enjoy particle physics so much, because we realize today, if you understand physics, we're in a simulation. This isn't really solid. We're in a simulation. The real reality is out there. If you've been in our Learn the Bible in 24 hours, as we take in Genesis, we talk about the 10 dimensions, how that we're split from 4 to 6, 4 that we still can read, 6 that are not directly accessible anymore. We call it the spiritual world. Yeah, but that's the real reality. Anyway, we'll move on here. What's our imperative? Paul goes on with this. He says, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. That is a command. It's an imperative mood. It's a command. It is in the present tense. Be continually strong. It's in the passive voice. You receive the action. You don't be strength in your strength. It's his strength. You receive his strength. Be strong in the Lord. Now, our imperative, twice Paul says, put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. We're up against the wiles of the devil. And that's the whole armor of God is the issue. You got to be completely armed, not just your favorite pieces, the whole thing. And you got to put it on before the battle begins. And by the way, the battle's already started. For many people, it started, as far as their awareness is concerned, September 11th of 2001. But we're in a battle. And it's not a battle against Islam. It's a battle that's supernatural. Where, again, he says in verse 13, take on the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in that evil day, and having done all to stand. Then he goes through and lists the armor of God, girded with truth, breastplate of righteousness, feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, shield of faith, helmet of salvation, sword of the Spirit. We could spend an hour on each one of these, but I'm going to challenge you to find out what they are. You need to know what they are in order to put them on. And it's not that simple. What do you mean by girded with truth? Pilate said, what is truth? Jesus gave him an answer. It's not that simple, too. We've got to get into it. Breastplate of righteousness. What does that mean? Not your righteousness, his. How do you put it on? Are there holes in it? Your feet shod with preparation. Hey, you got to prepare. You don't go in it unskilled. Part of the game is to be trained and be prepared. The shield of faith. Are there holes in your shield? The Roman soldiers repaired those between battles, not during the battle. Is there a weakness in your faith? Is there something that bothers you? You really don't have? Get it out on the table. Get an answer. Plug that hole now, not later. The helmet of salvation. What does that mean? Owning it's not enough. You got to wear it. If you're not wearing it, you can tell the people who aren't wearing it because we can tell by the bandages. Sword of the Spirit. Well, that's the scripture, yes, but you need to understand about swords. Longer swords give you a better reach. At the Naval Academy, I always had a long reach. That was always good for me because I hate boxing. But we had always boxing, wrestling, and hand-to-hand every year. But that it allowed me to at least survive. Sword, same thing. Long sword's better. Romans developed a 24-inch Machaira, and with it, they conquered the world. How they do that? There's two things you need to know about Machairas. It takes special training and lots of practice. And the same thing's true with this sword. Just having it ain't enough. You got to be trained, and you got to practice. Well, we can talk more about that. But the big one is the last one, the seventh one, the heavy artillery prayer. And boy, that's what you and I need to indulge in every day, heavy duty, for the sake of this country, the sake of our way of life. If you care about your children and grandchildren, you should be praying for George Bush and his staff for wisdom, insight, discernment. Because getting Osama bin Laden ain't going to do it. We're against something far deeper. And we got to deal with that. In fact, well, we need to make our watchword a 2 Chronicles 7:14. That should be our national verse. God says to gave Solomon a special commitment. He announced a principle. Yes, it applied to Israel specifically, but I believe our God changes not, that he announced a principle. If my people who are called by my name, if they'll do 4 things, I'll do 3 things. If they shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. 2 Chronicles 7:14. The one thing that Islam has going for it is the sin of America. They can point to it. It is manifest to the entire world. The profligacy, the moral exports of this country are a shame to even just average people, let alone people who are called by God's name. God says, if my people are called by my name, shall humble themselves. We know how to do that. They know how to pray. We know how to do that. And seek my face. That's a little different kind of thing. That's not an intellectual thing. That's a commitment kind of thing. But here's the one that's the rub. and turn from their wicked ways. And this is not the wicked ways of the nation that's in view here. It's the wicked ways in the body of Christ. It's not the sins of the unbelievers in America that's the problem. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sin. And guess what? And heal their land. And boy, should we applaud the rise of concern in the hearts of America since September 11th. Let's hope it's not a week or two flash in the pan. Let's hope it endures to be something more real, something more serious, something more lasting. But what comes of that is dependent on you and me. Don't depend on the silent pulpits in America that spoon feed the usual palaver. It's your job and mine. What's your action plan? Guard your reactions. Be a witness. Don't fall in the trap of a backlash against peace-loving Muslims. That's not the issue. We're not here. God loves those Muslims. He died for them. Repair our illiteracy, ourselves, yours and mine. Most Christians don't know their Bible. It's time to find out what it really says about everything. And find out what Islam is really all about. Don't fall for the propaganda that's tailored for political correctness. But we do need to realign our personal priorities. Every one of those should have changed on September 11th of the year 2001. And our most precious resource is time. You need to re-examine carefully, deliberately, how you spend your time and where God's program fits into that. And don't forget your heavy artillery prayer. It's time to get serious about our faith.